Hi guys, and welcome back to the Academy of Historical Fencing. A question I get fairly often is, what is the difference between a rapier and a sabre? And to me it often comes across as quite a strange question, and yet the more I think about it, it's understandable that they're kind of mixed up, particularly as the way they're shown in popular culture and films and things like that. Like old musketeer films, they sometimes used, Olympic sports sabres as rapiers and things like that. So the terminology is quite mixed at times, or misunderstood. And I want to talk about what the differences are between a rapier and a sabre, both historically and in terms of the weapons of themselves, and then how you use them, just to give you an overall idea, because there are some really weird misconceptions over it. So to just kind of compare the two, first of all, we actually have to establish what the terms even mean. Now, we'll start with rapier. The problem with the term rapier is that not even all cultures have even had a term like rapier for a sword like this. In Italy, for example, just called spada, a sword. So that's a confusing thing to begin with. But anyway, the term rapier. In Britain, the term rapier seems to have been used for any Italian style or Spanish style sword where you had a large guard that could allow the index finger to wrap over the quillon, that's the cross of the sword there, and is typically quite long and well suited to thrust in. But that's not to say that it can't cut, so it's quite a vague term. Again, people seem to think that, say, the rapier is a civilian sword and the sabre is a military sword, and that division doesn't really exist. This rapier I'm holding here is most definitely a civilian sword because it's ridiculously long, quite light and tapering to a very acute point. So this is the kind of sword, yes, carried civilian self-defense, but this is just one example. Rapiers can come in all different sizes and shapes and lengths and weights and all kinds of things. So the way we typically use rapier today is for the kind of golden era of rapier, if you like. It's the very late 16th century, going into the early 17th century, when you've got masters like Capoferro and Fabre teaching, and they're teaching for very long bladed rapiers for civilian use. But at the same time, military versions were being used as well, and you could rightfully call a smaller version of this with a heavier blade a military rapier, if you like. The terms, they don't fit so cleanly as back then as you would want them to today. The problem is when we look back at swords in history, is we're looking at hundreds or thousands of years of history across so many different cultures that we try and pinpoint terms for exact things so we can even communicate with one another as to what our meaning actually is. In that this actually, most cultures at the time that this was used would have just been called a sword. And then going on to say the issue of thrust versus cut, a lot of people would think that the rapier is a thrust-only sword, and there have been various things over the years where people have said the rapier can't cut, it's useless at cutting, they didn't cut with rapiers. Well, every single treatise that shows the rapier in use in the era this kind of sword was used shows cutting, even with the very long swords. Capoferro, which is the master I study from, he says a rapier, gives a few different ideas of how long it should be. He says if you stand up straight and put the rapier beside you, it should reach your armpit. And this one is actually a whisker longer than that. This is a 46.5-inch blade. It's an absolute monster. I would normally use a 45, which is exactly right for my height. But this is a copy from a museum piece in the Wallace collection, and it is unusual. Well, not unusually, but certainly larger, a little bit larger than average. It's very, very long. So, rapiers, they are thrust-focused, but cutting is still a really, really common and important part of the use of them. And are they just a civilian sword? No. The very long ones really should be just for civilian use, but there were much shorter and more robust blades as well, used for military use. So, for example, pikemen and musketeers, that kind of thing, would be carrying something that hilt end looked comparable to this, just the blade would be a bit wider, both at the force of the strong here, and usually a bit shorter. It doesn't necessarily mean they would taper less or more. Some of them tapered very finely to acute points and some of them didn't. So what is a rapier? Well, a rapier is realistically a sword that emphasises, not exclusively, but emphasises point work, allows the finger to wrap over the quillon for basically fine point work and manipulation, and has enough protection to provide for that grip to be used. And that's kind of a loose definition, and it has to be loose. It's a very loose definition of rapier. and it just gives you a kind of idea of the sword itself. The problem is that later on into the 18th century, the term rapier was also used for the small sword, which is rather smaller again. In fact, if you give me just a moment. So this is one of my small swords from the 18th century, early 18th century, Kalishimad shaped blade. And you see it still has the rings like a rapier would, but you can't really get your fingers in there. They're left partly just out of tradition, and partly because it's common to rest the finger, thumb like this on the grip. So you see that in the 18th century was also called a rapier, but it has no cutting edges. The blade is actually a triangular section. It would be terrible for cutting, both in terms of edge geometry and just mass. It would just cut very, very poorly if it was sharpened at all, which it isn't. So that one's not a cutter. That is thrust exclusive, which is unusual, and they did call that a rapier as well. But to some degree, we have to tighten down our terminology on swords a little bit so that we can even communicate with one another. So if this had a much broader, shorter blade on, we probably wouldn't call it a rapier, we would probably call it a side sword. And that's just because we have to, at times, nail these things down into some typology to even communicate and discuss both antiques and their use. And in terms of how much you cut and how much you thrust with this sword, that's going to be down to the individual. Basically, who you've learnt from, what you favour. If you just give somebody untrained a sword like this, they're going to hack away with it. And don't think for a moment that people that carried these swords were expert at using them. Some were, and a great majority probably weren't. That's down to basically how much practice you wanted to have, because these were just carried as a fashion and self-defence item in civilian life. And even when carried in military life, they probably didn't practice with the sword an awful lot because it wasn't the principal weapon for most of them. It was pike, musket, things like that. So there's the rapier. Terminology, the way we're using it, is the civilian self-defence sword, which would also be used for duelling. Again, people call it a dueling sword. It's not a dueling sword. Every sword that was popular in its day was used for dueling. What it really is a civilian self-defence sword. And yes, there are military versions of it. But for the sake of what we're talking about here, rapier, predominantly thrust work, really used for civilian self-defence. So there's the rapier for you. Right. On to sabre. Now the difficulty here with the sabre is quite what do people want to compare when they talk about sabre, because the sabre has existed for, well, since realistically about the 9th century, and they vary quite a lot in terms of size, weight, grip. There are all different kinds of sabres, so it's really, really difficult. So I'm going to show you a couple of typical examples. When people talk about the sabre, one of the things they're most commonly going to think of is something like this. Which, this is a 1796 British Light Cavalry trooper sword, or officer's one with the same. And it is a deeply curved, very broad, heavy slash-in sword that we use from horseback. And that's the way people typically think of the sabre, as a big, scimitar type kind of sword hacking away from horseback. And yes, they were used that way, but they were also used a lot of other ways, on foot, for example, and there were different kinds of shapes and all sorts. But this is representative of a great many sabres, because this is basically the same as a Polish or Hungarian sabre from 100 or even 200 years before. So this is kind of generically representative of a classic sort of light cavalry hussar's sabre. And is it cut only? Well, it has this hatchet point, which is not well suited to thrust work compared to spear-pointed blade. Spear-pointed is where the back edge and the true edge both taper in towards a point and is sharp on both sides then. And this is a hatchet point where just the true edge tapers into the back edge and the back is not sharp at all. That doesn't mean it couldn't be sharpened along this back edge section, but most hatchet points aren't. So it's just not quite as good at thrust work in terms of the angle of the point and also the way that it drives the point when you push. Spear pointed keeps the point on line. It just works a little bit better. But there are plenty of examples of people using these for thrusting. So, like the rapier is not just a thrust sword. The cavalry sabre, the hussar sabre like this, is not just a cutting sword. It really is not as simple as that. But to go through a few other examples, that's kind of what people would think of as the sort of cavalry hussar type sabre, and people say, oh, that's very Polish, but of course that's a British sword. but the British sword was based on sort of Polish, Hungarian, Austrian, Turkish as well sabres. So there's a lot of crossover. So don't look at a sword and say, oh, that's, you know, because it's a stirrup hilt heavy blade, that must be, you know, Polish or something. It's really not the way it works. Usually when a sword becomes popular, it tends to spread across a great many countries and cultures quite quickly. Right, and then this is the kind of other thing that people would think of as a sabre, because this is a Victorian infantry officer's sabre. First thing is, yes, the infantry did use sabres. Sabres were very commonly used on foot throughout many eras, not just on horseback. And they usually, although not always, are a bit lighter and a little bit shorter, just a little bit more agile on foot. So this is 1827 pattern rifle officer's sword, which is a nice typical example of a Victorian infantry officer's sword. Right, so that's just a very quick sort of comparison of the two. Now, in terms of length and weight, well, a sabre like this almost always comes into around about the 800 to 900 gram mark, which is about 2 pounds. And the rapier, of the kind of length that will come up to my armpit, for example, would normally be in the 1.2 to 1.5 kilogram mark. So you can already get a sense that the rapier is a lot heavier than most sabres. And even going back to the hussar type sort of light cavalry sabre, people think these are heavy. This is just 900 grams, and they didn't usually go much above 950. So they're still around about 2 pounds or just over. So it's not a heavy sword, and they're a lot lighter than the rapier. Of course, two factors there really are significant, and one is the length, is that a sabre would typically have a blade of somewhere around about 32 to 33 inch, roughly. That's a kind of a typical average, when the typical rapier is 42 to 45 inch. So already the size difference is huge. And yes, that's going to be significant in terms of the weight. And also, of course, a rapier has a really quite substantial guard of all these sweeping bars, which is going to add weight compared to the sabre. And notice that they often have quite a substantial pommel for counterbalance weight as well, as opposed to the sabre. I mean, you can get sabres with pommels like this on, but certainly when you get to, in Britain, the late 18th century and earlier in other countries, basically 100 years before, you tend to move to this backstrap style, which kind of, the metal back edge piece and kind of pommel all cast in just one piece, as opposed to having a pommel counterbalance. And the back straps tend to be a bit lighter than having a pommel, and that works quite well for a sabre because it's not a particularly long sword and you want weight in the tip for striking power. So there you go. In terms of length, I suppose I should show them vertically. If this rapier stands in front of me, and I did say it was about an inch to inch and a half longer than I normally use, but even so, and the sabre, I don't know if you'll even see it on the video, the sabre is now on the floor beside it. So roughly in scale, that's the difference. Absolutely vast. The rapier is a very, very long sword, and the sabre is not. The sabre is just a good sort of medium length. In fact, a typical sabre is roughly the sort of length of most medieval arming swords, one-handed arming swords, or a lot of Viking swords as well. But the rapier is unusually long. Okay, so what other differences do we have? Well, one of the biggest things is how it's gripped. Now, if we go back to something like this, a sabre like this is commonly held in a hammer grip like this. In fact, the manual that we teach from does say that quite heavy blades or quite curved blades are not well suited to having the thumb on the back strap, which is common when you get to Victorian swords like this, and also for spadroons. This kind of grip, the thumb on the back strap, it allows the sword to go in line with the forearm. It's much better for thrust work, and it allows certain snapping actions to be quite effective. But when you've got something with quite a bit of mass in the blade or a lot of curvature, it's quite an unwieldy grip, and that is mentioned in, say, the Royal manual that we teach from. So you go to a hammer grip like this, whereas it goes for a Victorian infantry sword, thumb on the back strap, and you've got really good manipulation and really good point work, point on line towards with the forearm. So yeah, you've got hammer grip or thumb pointing at the back or back strap. Whereas the rapier, there are a few ways that rapiers were held, but by far the most common was the index finger going over the cross or the quillen and the thumb resting on top of it. And that does a sort of similar thing to the thumb grip on the infantry sabre, well, that was used on cavalry as well, but on the sort of slightly lighter sabres. It does a similar thing, but it also, with this massive length of the rapier, it takes a lot of fatigue off of the wrist as well. It allows quite fine manipulation for disengages. That's where we just move from one side of the opponent's blade to another with just this sort of scooping action. So yeah, the grip is very, very different, and this is hugely beneficial to a sword this size. And the only real disadvantage that it has is during certain disarm actions is that it can work against you, is that it can trap your hand and potentially get fingers and broken nastiness like that. But usually that shouldn't be a concern because you should have stabbed or hit your opponent quite hard before they actually got to that. So try not to get disarmed with it, and that's why you want to carry a dagger or one of these really. Anyone gets close, you stab them with the dagger. Anyway, so the grips are very, very different. Is that we've got hammer grip or thumb on the back for sabre, and we've got finger wrapped on the quillen on rapier. So that's different. Now, the blades. Rapiers, and this one's blunt. This is a Denelli, very high quality reproduction of a museum piece. I have owned one original rapier, but I sold that when I bought this house. And I handled a lot more, and rapiers are double-edged. And they tend to be sharpened all the way up to the hilt here. Not all of them, but a lot. Sometimes you'll see this section being completely blunt, but even Capoferro actually says it wouldn't need to be sharp except for stopping people grabbing it. So they sharpen this just to stop those disarm techniques. So yes, it's very frequently sharpened all the way, but not always. And you will find rapiers that don't have any edges at all. They have basically square sort of section blades. They're like a fire poker designed just for thrust work, but they're quite unusual. The vast majority of rapiers are double-edged, sometimes fulled, sometimes not, but they're double-edged and taper into a very acute point. And even this, which is a blunt and tipped, you can see it tapers to a very acute point. So towards the tip, it's just about 5 or 6 millimeters wide here. It's a very, very narrow tip and tapering all the way. Now, what that does is provide very, very fast tip action in terms of your disengages and working around blades. It's incredibly fast on point work. But of course, not as good on thrust work. Not as good on cut work. If you want to have a sword that is good at cutting, you want more and more mass at the tip. Okay? Of course, the more mass you have at the tip, the less agility you have. It becomes slower to stop and start and change direction and things like that, which is why you see some of this Polish cross-cutting where they're using quite substantial, like the hussars, like cavalry sabre I showed you, and they're just cutting and carrying on through on their cuts because it's slow to actually try and stop it, so you use the momentum to just carry it through. Whereas in a rapier, it's really, really fine. We're just using actions of manipulating the hilt and just disengaging the tip of the sword really, really quickly. So yeah, rapier tapers very acutely towards the tip, which means a reduced cutting ability, but incredible speed on the thrust work. As opposed to a sabre, the light cavalry sabre actually broadens at the tip here. But of course it does also have distal taper to the level that it's about 9 millimeters strong, thick here and down to sort of 1 millimeter at the tip. So the distal taper does mean it lightens out towards the tip, which is why it's not as heavy as it actually looks. It looks like it's going to be a really heavy sword, but that's why, it's because the distal taper is extreme. So it's very, very thin at the tip there, despite the fact that the profile taper is ridiculous, is that it tapers outwards towards the tip, which adds quite a nice bit of cutting power, but compared to the rapier is slow in some actions of stop, start and that kind of thing. And then you get sabres which are in between, what's they always called the cut and thrust sort of sabre in the Victorian cut and thrust sword, where it doesn't taper into the point until the last moment. So the kind of thickness of the blade doesn't change much from there to there, which means you've got sort of, good cutting power, not as good as the light cav, but a lot more than a rapier. And then it's spear pointed, which means it's going to thrust almost as well as a rapier. It's just not quite as quick at the tip because it still doesn't taper until the last moment. And of course, just for comparison, not all cavalry swords flare at the tip like the light cav. This is 1853, so this is an equivalent era cavalry sword, so the same era to this rifle officer's sword. And you can see that the blade profile is exactly the same, just that the cavalry sword is made more substantial and larger in every way, but the sort of shape is the same, it's just proportionately larger. So, there we have it. Rapier blades, much longer, tapering very quickly to an acute tip. Sabre blades, not tapering much at all along their length until they get to a spear point, and sometimes actually go in the opposite direction and getting wider towards the tip, which means a lot more cutting power, but slower on thrust work. Right, what else is there to discuss about the difference between the two? We've talked about the grip type, the blade length, the blade profile, and taper. I suppose that covers the two swords overall in terms of their values. Now I've got to talk about how they're used. In fact, the rapier and sabre couldn't be much more apart from the fact that they're single-handed. They don't really have much more in common, in that the sabre emphasises cut work usually over thrust work, whereas the rapier favours thrust work over cut work. The sabre is typically taught in a parry-riposte style, and that means being what we would call two-time or double-time motions, where we would parry, which is a block, and then respond with an action. So attack and defence are two separate actions, whereas in a rapier, say from the Italian tradition, is we try and do all of that in one, which is actually more like, say, Lechtenauer's sort of German longsword, where we have a sword out in front of us, an attack comes in, and we actually engage, put the point on line, and drive the point in all at once. So our attack and defence is one motion, single time defence, for example, as opposed to the parry riposte that we typically expect of sabre. So there you can see emphasis on point, emphasis on cut, double time parry riposte, single time rapier. So you're already seeing huge differences in how they're being used, how they're being taught. Now, could you use them according to the same methods? Yes, you could, very much so. Some fighters you will see fighting rapier and then fighting sabre, and they're kind of using the same style. There is actually a fair bit in common in terms of, say, the footwork, for example. Compare British military footwork to Italian rapier footwork. It's very, very similar. A lot of the cuts and thrusts you're doing are the same, even though you're favouring one over the other in terms of thrust to cut. But when you do the thrusts and cuts over the two, they're often very, very similar. But that timing of the parry riposte is very, very different. Which isn't to say there aren't parry riposte techniques in rapier. There are. They're just not as favourable as single time. I suppose I should have mentioned hand protection. Rapiers pretty much always have a large amount of hand protection, and sabres vary immensely from having just a knuckle bow. In fact, earlier sabres had nothing but a typical cross that you'd expect on a medieval sword. But most sabres would have something like a knuckle bow, or going up to, say, the 3-bar hilts, bowl hilts, all kinds of shell guards and all kinds of things. So the protection level varies. So, how do the rapier and the sabre vary ultimately? Well, one is favouring the cut, one is favouring the thrust, although both use both cut and thrust. The grip is very, very different. The blade profile is quite different to the level that the sabre is comparatively broad at the tip, whereas the rapier is not. And the length is hugely different, which means that the rapier really favours keeping people at distance and using thrust work as opposed to the cut work of the sabre. So there you go, that's a sort of a brief overview, and it's really difficult to actually go much further than that because you'd have to compare exact model swords in exact time periods, because sabres and rapiers changed a lot over time. I mean, the rapier's use was realistically somewhere in the early to mid 16th century introduction and used up into the 18th century, and they changed quite a lot in that time. And the sabre came from around about 9th century and used up till the end of the 19th, or in some places even into the 20th century. So you'd have to really compare exact examples. But that's comparing some typical stuff that we use in the club, typical sort of Northern European stuff that you'd see from the 16th up to the 18th century. So I suppose another thing I should have mentioned is kind of the obvious that I kind of forgot at the start is sabres are curved. Now, at times people have referred to some straight blades as sabres. Realistically, as far as English goes, sabres are curved swords, rapiers are straight swords. Sabres are single-edged, so we have a completely blunt back edge. It doesn't mean they can't be sharpened towards the tip on the last sort of, back edge section, but the majority of the blade is blunt on the back. So sabre is curved, single-edged, rapier is straight and double-edged. So I think that kind of covers the majority of what I want to talk about with the swords. We're seeing quite a bit of difference therefore between their overall construction, some elements of the way they're taught and they're used. In terms of civilian versus military and things like that, the rapier, as I've shown you, is very much a civilian sword, but as I said, there are military versions of it. The sabre I'm showing you here is definitely a military sword, but there were various sabres used throughout history that were used for civilian wear and hunting and all sorts. So yeah, there were civilian sabres as well. And lastly, in terms of what they're paired with, the sabre is typically taught solo. It's quite unusual to see much in Europe, certainly, of material with a sabre being used with anything like a dagger or a buckler or a shield or something like that. There are a few examples, but it's quite rare. Whereas if you go to, say, the Middle East, you will find sabres being paired with bucklers and shields very commonly, and also another sabre for that matter. But that's a sort of a cultural difference more than the actual weapon and how it's used. Whereas the rapier, although it was used solo, it was very, very commonly, particularly at that length, paired with something like a dagger, shield, cloak, another rapier, so all sorts of things. Of course, the one thing that sabre like this did get paired with very successfully was the pistol, because this sabre specifically was in use when revolvers were used, and obviously revolver and sabre is a very nice combination indeed. So that's just a last bit of comparison. Two swords that were incredibly effective, that we really enjoy using in the club, and there are of course some similarities that you could see, particularly in the fighting style, but overall they are incredibly different in terms of construction and training methods, even though some things you might see some crossover with. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you've got any questions, please post them in the comments section. I'm sure there's so much more to say about this topic. I do hope you enjoyed the video, and please subscribe if you haven't already.